share a bit about your lineage and what being connected to land means to you?
Yeah, so I am of the Teguima band of the Opata Nation of the village of Opasuda in Sonora, Mexico. It's the place of ironwood. Um, so I'm indigenous Sonorense from on my mother's side. Uh, we're also Chicano on that side in that, our family that Mexico US border didn't really apply to our family historically. We were always crossing it, up into the Tucson region, down into Oposura and Hermosillo. And then when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo hit, nothing really changed for us. And I do have a profound relationship to that land, which I'll talk about. On my father's side, we're of the Picuncha band of the Mapuche Nation. This is a highly assimilated band that's in the kind of northern reaches of the traditional Mapuche territory. And I do have relationship to that land as well. My grandfather is from a village called Lolol, which is a place of um, freshwater freshwater shrimp. And then my grandmother is from a village called Yumbel, which is the place of the dawn. And that's in the Bio region in the Mapuche territory.
My name is Flavio Cuevas,
My name is Abraham Allison.
My name is Emily Ramirez.
and we will be doing our podcast on Indigenous struggles for federal recognition. Have you ever wondered why certain tribes are offered more benefits than others? Have you ever wondered why certain tribes are allowed casinos on their own land? Have you ever wondered why certain tribes are more impoverished than other tribes? These are questions that all tie in to the dilemma, the very real issue of being federally recognized or not in this country that affects Native American tribes all across the country.
A major part of our research focused on the process of federal recognition as itself and outlining the reasons why some tribes may never achieve federal recognition.
Federal recognition, state recognition, sometimes even at the city level, you have recognition, and then you have a whole slew of people who are just not recognized or non-enrolled or have been unenrolled. And so that's where you get elements of lateral violence within indigenous communities. You can look at the Dry Creek Pomo, for instance, who were unenrolling people uh, mainly because of casino profits, right? And it's like, oh, you shouldn't be part of this money pie. Then you can look at the Shumash, who they took that federal recognition and they used it differently. They said, we're going to create a medical center, and we're going to take this casino funding and use it for language reclamation. And obviously imperfect as well, but I think there's a certain level of autonomy that comes with federal recognition. But there's also a certain level of exclusivity that comes with it.
One such tribe is the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. They face many challenges. Their story begins all the way back in 1989. After obtaining their positive determination of previous unambiguous federal recognition, meaning that the tribe had already been recognized federally in the past, the Muwekma tribe still had to submit additional documentation to satisfy the bar's 7 mandatory criteria. All of these things in conjunction basically mean that they needed an assortment of records, genealogical records, archaeological records, records of their land ownership, proving their people's existence on that land. Almost 2 years later, the resulting submission of several hundred pages of additional documentation, Deborah Maddox, the division chief of tribal operations, issued a letter to the tribe stating that a review of the Muwekma submission shows that there is sufficient evidence to review the petition on all of the 7 mandatory criteria. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is placing the Muwekma petition on the ready for active consideration lists as of March 26, 1998. Despite this, they had been denied their recognition, and a fierce legal battle ensued. To this day, the tribe still does not have the federal recognition status that its people sought to claim. And so these barriers placed by the government for tribes to achieve federal recognition are a big reason why some tribes will be staying on the wait list for generations. Tribes are required to submit multiple rounds of documentation to the Department of Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, in order to get their petition further and to be seen by courts and eventually be approved by Congress. So why is federal recognition so important? Well, federal recognition allows tribes to access to crucial federal funding for services like healthcare, education, housing, economic development, and certain grants to legal standing, in addition to managing land, resources, and exercising their sovereign rights. And that can include establishing courts and law enforcement agencies within their land. For example, the Pamunkey Indian tribe in Virginia, which received federal recognition in 2016 after a 35-year struggle, had finally been able to pursue economic development opportunities and strengthen its cultural heritage within its land.
Federal like the process of becoming federally recognized is incredibly time consuming and it's incredibly costly. The Yoeme, the Pasco Yaqui, if I'm not mistaken, down in Arizona, they just received federal recognition in like 1970 something, despite, being there, inhabiting that area, since time immemorial. And so it's more expensive and it takes a lot longer. You have to prove continual habitation in a particular area, and you also have to prove like continual kind of indigeneity and continual indigenous practices or language or whatever. And so how then do you prove that if you have been permanently displaced? If your land has been stolen, how can you prove, and you've been displaced off that land, how do you then prove, continual inhabitation? If you've been thrown into residential schools or assimilated or Americanized in other ways, and you've had to leave your language or traditions behind in order to survive, how then do you prove that? And so that's the rub with that's the very difficult aspect of federal recognition that's not commonly understood.
As Abraham listed before, the Act essentially talks about the application process, which is complex and lengthy and very costly, and includes providing extensive historical and genealogical documentation that many tribes don't possess, which makes recognition close to impossible. These struggles are deeply rooted in the U.S.'s long history of mistreatment towards Indigenous people, including attempted genocide, land disposition, and forced assimilation. The history behind why Indigenous tribes struggle to receive federal recognition in the United States reveals generational struggles stemming from inconsistent legal standards and systemic discrimination. This makes the process not just a legal challenge, but also a reflection of centuries-long governmental control over Indigenous identity and sovereignty. Starting with the Trail of Tears and continuing into the present, where journalists have identified 2 million acres of Indigenous land scheduled for the construction of federal prisons, Indigenous people have consistently had their ancestral homelands taken by either force or fraud. In the early 19th century, the U.S. government deceived numerous tribes into signing more than 40 treaties, ceding their land to the United States. These Indigenous tribes were forcibly displaced due to the U.S. government looking to hold more land westward, and decided that moving Indigenous people more inland would allow them to have more land settlement over Europe, thus creating what the U.S. government believed to be an agreement, air quotations, agreement, that Indigenous lands no longer belong to their respective tribes, despite the fact that most of these treaties were signed by a small minority of tribal members. Ultimately, this caused all indigenous tribes involved to sever their ties to their ancestral land and limited their ability to control their own resources, constricting their ability to grow their economy and future developments. This caused numerous environmental and economic disparities, which left many vulnerable to harsh conditions they had no experience in, essentially forcing them to occupy these lands due to the fact that most reservations are still there to this day. Now, in the terms of genocide, a notable one was brought on by the California Gold Rush, which caused the California Massacre of the 1980s to the 1960s. The governor of California at the time, Peter Burnett, proposed a genocidal order against indigenous peoples, which influenced calls for extermination of the indigenous population in the state. This triggered a monetary incentive for the body parts of indigenous peoples. A skull or scalp at the time was worth $5, and just to put into perspective, the daily average wage was 25 cents. The indigenous population in California dropped from 150,000 in 1846 to just 30,000 in 1873. So just within 30 years, it dropped almost 120,000. So many died due to these atrocities. Countless tribes lost vital members of their communities. Indigenous women were forcibly sterilized. Women and children were beheaded and paraded through the streets. Naturally, this caused a significant issue with locating vital genealogical and historical documentation that is required by the federal government's recognition process, because most of it was lost or incidents were never documented. The forced assimilation of Native children started with the Dawes Act of 1887, or also known as the General Allotment Act, which made it possible for the U.S. government to break up reservations and form individual plots in an effort to assimilate indigenous people into mainstream society. Hundreds of thousands of indigenous children were taken from their lands and removed from their families in order to attend these government-run boarding schools or placed in adoptive non-indigenous families. These children experienced horrific atrocities. Many were tortured, starved, and forced into sexual or exploitive labor. These schools punished the children for speaking their native languages and practicing their cultures in an effort to traumatize them into assimilation. Many children, unfortunately, did not leave these schools alive or at all. Cemeteries were actually placed on the school grounds, both marked and unmarked. To this day, there are still unmarked graves in various places along the United States and in Canada. The ideological goal of assimilation was to essentially kill the Indian and save the man. The systemic erasure of indigenous culture, language, and identity severed vital ties to ancestry and community. It made it far more difficult for tribes to prove their continuous existence and gain federal recognition in the present day. So much culture was lost in these schools, and these children were never the same.
Let's take into account the context of today. When it comes to the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the United States Supreme Court, a lot of Native Americans have a bad taste in their mouth after the death of this great Supreme Court justice. The reason for this is not really known to the wide public, but when it comes to, in particular, the Oneida Nation, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in a case titled Sherrill v. Oneida Indian Nation, which was in 2005, to deliver the 8-1 majority that struck down the tribe's chance at purchasing some of their lands back, she, quote, said, "Given the long-standing non-Indian character of the area and its inhabitants, the regulatory authority constantly exercised by New York State and its counties and towns, and the Oneidas' long delay in seeking judicial relief against parties other than the United States, we hold that the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty, in whole or in part, over the parcels at issue." This was a controversial decision amongst the Native American community. It is one that came across as very hypocritical when it comes to the ancient sovereignty, quote unquote, of native land by native peoples. When it comes to a tribe such as the Lumbee in North Carolina, this is also a point of controversy in the Native American community. The Lumbee are a tribe of people who genealogically and historically very mixed. They themselves had laid many false claims to certain genealogical and historically land in the upper area of North Carolina.
There's a few dynamics that I think are important to talk about here. One is when you talk about southeastern nations, specifically Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Lumbee, etc. They're not stereotypically they're not stereotypically what you would picture phenotypically for indigenous people. They'll have the brown folks with the black hair, but they'll also have black folks. They'll also are phenotypically like black folks and phenotypically white folks who either may or may claim to have some indigenous heritage. So I don't want to take away anybody's indigenous heritage. I'm not trying to do that, but we are in a very particular white supremacist project happening now. So within that context, I could see him, meeting with a more phenotypically white indigenous person and be more willing to federally recognize them. Then the other kind of dangerous aspect of this is, in my view, to me, this sets a dangerous precedent for indigenous people in general, in that, well, if we suck up to Trump, we can get our federal recognition. If we could kiss his ass and take part in his authoritarian regime, they take part in his fascistic aligned projects, his white supremacist projects, then we are more likely to get federally recognized.
In 2019, a Cherokee chief testified against the recognition of the Lumbee, stating specifically that he did not feel that, as someone who represents the tribe of the Cherokee, who can only receive so little resources at the time under the Trump administration in 2019, he stated that he felt that it was unfair for a tribe like the Lumbee, who have laid false claims to the identity of being Native American, for them to also be receiving resources when, first and foremost, the direct descendants of those who, quote unquote, directly quoting him, the direct descendants of those who survived one of the most calculated genocides in the history of mankind, the Trail of Tears. He felt that this group laying false claim to the identity of being Native American was unfair and unjust, historically and presently. And this is a point of controversy because, as of late, due to the Lumbee tribe's adamant support for Donald Trump signed a bill in order to make it much easier for the Lumbee tribe to be federally recognized. This caused much concern for Native tribes because it showed a trend of Trump only supporting people who wear red hats or who are on social media advocating for him and voting for him. It is a kind of bias that shows a lack of moral character in the presidency, especially when Native people are at times last in line in Trump's rhetoric. My biggest takeaway from looking at the modern examples of the indigenous struggles for federal recognition was that this is too large of an issue to go unnoticed and to go to go without discussion. I feel that Native people should not have to result to infighting, such as with the example of the Lumbee. I feel like Native people should not be seen as the lesser and at the back of the Supreme Court justices' minds. I feel that it's it's completely unfair given the history and the genocide that occurred in this country, as Emily outlined in her historical context. I really enjoyed, as someone who's Native myself, being able to use this topic in order to learn more about the Northern Native American people and their struggle for the smallest thing, which is just to be acknowledged.
Through my research, I was so shocked to see how arduous the entire process is for federal recognition. And I can see why so many tribes have waited to receive their decision, whether or not they've been approved or denied. And it's a very sad thing to me. I think that the mix of Native peoples across this continent is so vast that if they do have the knowledge of their ancestry and want to organize and become federally recognized, I think that in some ways getting genealogical records is valid, but then in other ways, having the money and the legal power to go through the courts, not everyone has that. And so I really hope that tribes that are currently petitioning and they have all of the best intentions and their members are so dedicated to their people and their cause and their culture, I hope that they can receive comfort and receive that recognition that they're fighting so fiercely for.
If you're ever working with indigenous communities, humility is first and foremost. And part of that humility is, really talking to people and like indigenous leadership is key. You never go up into an indigenous community and tell people what to do or how to do. You see what's happening, you see how you can support, you humbly request to be able to support, and then you show up and you do the work. And if you're not prepared to show up and do the work, you shouldn't be going to indigenous communities, period. It's like that accountability and reciprocity is incredibly real. And so like actions speak and talk is cheap when it comes to supporting people with federal recognition. This is really more of like a legal realm. So federal recognition is more like if you are a legal scholar, then you can really support in this process because there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of paperwork. In my own community, I don't do the federal recognition work. I do the cultural preservation work because I don't want to do the federal recognition work. It's not my strength. I'm not a legal scholar. That's what I would say about that.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Flavio pointed out that politicians have a tendency to only care about federal indigenous recognition when it directly benefits them. And I think that is something that really needs to be talked about more. I also really enjoyed how Abraham spoke a lot about how essentially like it is very costly and very lengthy, and about how it is essentially like just a very tough process, and why these tribes essentially choose to wait so long to do it, or not even that they wait so long, but rather it takes so long to even get the proper documentation to begin the process. But what I think really we should all maybe leave this with, is that this community is such a resilient community. I mean, they started this country and they will be here, till the very end of time. Nothing is going to ever stop them from continuing just their traditions and continuing to live the way that they live. And I think that that's beautiful.
That concludes our podcast. Thank you so much.